come on up. We have our scripture from one of our scouts. Thank you for sharing this morning.
Okay. Galatians 5:22 through 26. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things, and those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another.
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to give a big hand to our scouts this morning. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Denise, John, for your leadership, for helping organize all the scouts to be here. It's so great to see you all. We're glad that you're leading us in worship this morning. Just another example of young people leading us in our faith, calling us to live as people of God and in the way of Christ. Speaking of young people, I was talking with my son earlier this week, and he asked, well, what are you preaching on Sunday? They like a little preview, I guess, my children. And so, what are you preaching on? I said, we're starting a new sermon series, The Gospel According to Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And he said, who's Mr. Rogers? And immediately, I took a hard look at my parenting skills and thought, I have failed my children. What do you mean? Who is Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, he wears cool sweaters or cardigans sometimes. He walks in the door and immediately changes his shoes. I don't know why he does it, but that's what he does. And he sings that song, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Mr. Rogers. He talks really slowly, and he waits. When he asks a question for the person to respond, it's Mr. Rogers. My voice is rising as I'm trying to explain this because surely he knows who Mr. Rogers is. Trolley comes in and then takes them all to the world of make-believe. And there's Daniel Tiger speaking to all the children. That cartoon, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, that you saw as a kid? That was Mr. Rogers' idea. You know who Mr. Rogers is. And at this point, I'm freaking out. And he's looking at me, and he's smiling. He's on the verge of laughter as he says, Dad, I know who Mr. Rogers is. I'm just messing with you. And that's when I know I take a hard look at my parenting skills, and I just pat myself on the back. I've done a good job. There's another sarcastic, funny Silvers in the world. So when I'm gone, you're welcome, world. There's at least one more of us, 2 more, 3 more, who knows? There's enough. Each year we try to do a Gospel According to series. We sometimes do it on music. We'll look at a band and listen to their lyrics and delve a little deeper. We've done movies where we try to suss out some faith meaning from those places. And this morning, as we begin our sermon series on Mr. Rogers, what we're trying to do is connect faith to things we hear in the real world, to see the implications of how God moves and breathes and calls us to be the people of God in the world. And so we do this through a variety of lenses. This morning, and for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking through the lens of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, listening for the good news along the way. Mr. Rogers was born in 1928 near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was a music major, college graduated with his BA in music, and he went to seminary eventually, and in 1963 became an ordained Presbyterian pastor. He was a dedicated educator in public broadcasting. He received acclaim for his commitment, not just for caring for kids and helping them navigate hard lessons of life, but really listening and engaging with the needs of young people. He had hard episodes. If you go back, you look at some of the things he talked about. He talked about divorce, sibling rivalry, death, fear, political unrest. He had episodes that addressed the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, and other important topics of the day. Daniel Tiger just had an episode on surviving the COVID pandemic. He was committed to the emotional and spiritual well-being of young people. And he was a jack of all trades. He not only wrote and edited the television series, but he also wrote and performed a lot of the songs that you hear on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He had not only the educational readiness of young people in mind, but their emotional readiness, their psychological development. He worked with child psychologists along the way to make sure that he was meeting the needs as best he could to be a good listener and a caregiver to the young people of his day and time. And he had a presence about him. When TV was speeding up, Mr. Rogers was slowing down. He saw television as the perfect setting, the perfect medium to connect with children and with families. He saw this opportunity not just for entertainment and marketing, but a tool that could be used, an avenue for making the world a better place. He had this uncanny ability to be patient and to really listen. And you could see it on the faces of the children and interviews that he would have with them, how he was right there, listening to every word, taking it in, and they felt heard. He once said, "How many times have you noticed that it's the little quiet moments in the midst of life that seem to give the rest extra special meaning?" A moment ago, we heard about the fruits of the Spirit: joy, love, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Mr. Rogers was one of those unique characters that could embody the fruit of the Spirit. As I mentioned last week, the Apostle Paul, he was writing to the church in Galatia. They were having this crisis of law and faith. He was encouraging them to let go of following the letter of the law and embrace following the spirit of the law. To follow in the steps of Jesus, for Jesus is offering us freedom. But we must clarify, this isn't a freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want. That's not the kind of freedom Jesus was sharing with that first century world, and it's not the kind of freedom that Paul is talking about. This is freedom rooted in relationship. One commentator said it this way: freedom is not separation from relationships, it is a feature of relationships that becomes especially apparent as a result of our relationships with Jesus Christ. Essentially, freedom, true freedom, is tied to our responsibility within the context of the relationships, the connections that we have with one another. The Apostle Paul understood this, that the fruits of the Spirit are those that are born in the context of relationship and community, the connections that we have with one another, and our responsibility to those relationships. This freedom is born out of that responsibility to bear one another's burdens, as we heard last week, to journey alongside when we are hurting and when our world seems broken. In the first century world, Paul puts this in contrast to our fleshly or earthly, even abusive desires. Desires like jealousy, or he even says to put ourselves in factions to separate ourselves from one another, and strife. But the fruits of the Spirit are contrary to these desires. They are the visible and experiential sign of a life dedicated to following the path of Jesus. Think of those stories of Jesus that stick with you the most. Think of those ones that you can recall from hearing in your early education of faith. Those stories have at the root of them love, joy, peace, patience, these fruits of the Spirit. And they are the outward signs of a commitment to a loving God and following in the steps of Christ. Fred Rogers is just one example of a person who embodied these fruits of the Spirit. A few years back, True False Film Festival in Columbia, Missouri. It's coming up again. And I watched the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Can you guess who it was about? In that episode, there was this, in that movie, they talked about this amazing episode in season 11, episode 4, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where Jeff Erlinger, a young man, sat for a chat with his idol, Mr. Rogers. Jeff Erlinger had a tumor on his spine when he was 7 months old, and it damaged his nerves. And so he needed an electric wheelchair to get around. After several surgeries, it prevented him from walking, and Jeff told his parents as he was facing yet another surgery that he wanted to meet Mr. Rogers. So his parents reached out to Fred and told him about their situation and said that our son, he wants to meet you before he has to go in for this very dangerous surgery. Would you be open for that? Of course, Mr. Rogers responded and said yes. I'd like to have him on the show. I'll talk with him for a bit, then we'll sing a song together. His parents were like, you're going to sing a song together? Are you sure? In that episode, you can see Mr. Roger comes out as Fred comes into the scene off to the side. He comes out, he sits down on the porch and just starts talking with Jeff. He asks him about the chair that he's in. He asks him about his life. He asks him about his joys. And then they said, I'd like to sing a song with you. Is that okay? And Jeff says yes. And they sing this song, It's You I Like. The words go like this. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you. Not your toys, they're just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new, I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like. It's you yourself. It's you. It's you I like. After the episode concluded, Jeff's parents naturally went up to the producers and said, did it go okay? And they said, oh yeah, it's really good. It's really good. Because you could tell Mr. Rogers wasn't just singing a song, but he was speaking directly to Jeff and others like Jeff who had hard times in their life. Jeff's parents said how much that moment meant to their son, how important it was, how Mr. Rogers had shaped his thinking about himself and the world. And Jeff would eventually, he would survive that surgery, he would grow up, and he would become an activist, an advocate in his community for people like him. He ran for Madison Common Council in 2002, and he advocated for others to be welcomed and treated well. He was one of many who felt heard and cared for by Mr. Rogers, and he wanted to pass that feeling, that care, that love on to his community, to his neighbors. What made Fred Rogers so appealing to children? Maybe it was his ministry of presence, his ability to just be there and listen. He once said, listening is where love begins. Did you hear that? Listening is where love begins. Listening to ourselves and then to our neighbors. He didn't just embody the fruits of the Spirit. He listened. He waited. He sat with young people and was genuinely interested in what they had to say. He wasn't in a rush to get on with it or to get to the point. He was just content being in the moment with whomever he was with. And it's this ministry of presence that's so crucial, so central to what made Fred Rogers so impactful. He understood the overwhelming fear and emotions that children feel, and he knew the best way to offer comfort, listen, to be faithful, to be a calming presence in the storms of life. He once said, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You always find people who are helping. He went on to say, to this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I'm always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. Look for the helpers. Fred Rogers was a helper, a calm, caring, loving presence in the lives of many. Whether they met face to face or through the TV screen in the living room. His faithful and authentic presence helped so many navigate the storms of life. And he was a helper, a neighbor. Won't you be a neighbor too? A helpful presence to those young people in your life, listening, being in the moment, hearing their fears and concerns, and walking with them through those. I pray you will, that the fruits of the Spirit will be a guide to you. Love, patience, gentleness, and that calming presence to help us navigate together the storms we face. Maybe that's what being a good neighbor is all about.